back? Well, in Victoria, the Allan government is putting even more pressure on the housing crisis, forcing developers this time to pay more than $11,000 in tax on every new apartment under new planning laws.
There's a boom in the number of homes up for sale, with claims property investors are fleeing Victoria because of higher land tax and interest rates.
Thousands of rentals are set to disappear from the market as rising taxes force landlords to sell up.
Here's what's happening in Victoria right now. The state's Premier just stormed out of a press conference after being grilled about a financial disaster that's driving investors out of the state in record numbers. Over 21,000 rental properties vanished from the Victorian market in just 12 months. That's not investors taking a break. That's a full-scale capital exodus. And for the first time since records began in 1999, Victoria's rental bond numbers are going backwards. Let that sink in. While Melbourne's population grew by over 100,000 people in that same period, the number of available rental homes actually shrank. This isn't a coincidence. This is the market screaming that something is fundamentally broken. And that something is Victoria's brutal new tax regime that's absolutely destroying the investment case for holding property in the state.
Hospitality worker then Uka knows firsthand our rental market is buckling at the seams.
About 50 to 80 people in line just to inspect the properties.
And it's about to get worse as higher land taxes see investors leaving Victoria in droves.
In this video, I'm breaking down exactly what triggered Premier Jacinta Allan's press conference meltdown at Broadmeadows, why the state's land tax changes are forcing investors to sell at the fastest rate on record, and how Victoria's desperation to fund a nearly $200 billion debt mountain is creating a rental crisis that's crushing tenants. Let's get into it. Right, let's start with the tax that's got everyone talking, because the numbers are absolutely cooked. On January 1st, 2024, the Victorian government slashed the land tax threshold from $300,000 down to just $50,000. That brought an additional 380,000 property owners into the tax net overnight.
So this is one of the biggest changes in my view for land tax here in Victoria. So as you'll see in that first point there, it used to just be in 16 inner and middle suburbs here in Victoria. But as of this year, that has increased to the whole of Victoria.
These aren't wealthy moguls. These are mum and dad investors who own a single apartment or a modest investment property. Here's how brutal this is in practice. If you owned a single investment apartment with a land value of $150,000, you used to pay zero land tax. Now you're paying $975 every single year under the new COVID debt repayment surcharge. That's nearly $1,000 in new annual costs that didn't exist 18 months ago. And the pain doesn't stop there. The government also introduced flat surcharges depending on your total land holdings. Properties with land values between $50,000 and $100,000 cop a $500 annual surcharge. Land values between $100,000 and $300,000 get hit with $975. For investors with multiple properties, these costs stack brutally fast.
With a portfolio that once spanned 9 properties in 4 states, Dean Campion says property investment isn't what it used to be.
Having a property is less and less attractive.
He says rising costs in Victoria recently saw him sell 3 homes in Gippsland, joining what the industry says is droves of landlords pulling up stumps.
But the land tax is only half the story. The other tax that's got developers screaming is the new activity centre developer levy. Opposition politicians have labelled this the $11,000 tax, and it's stopping apartment projects dead in their tracks across Melbourne. The Victorian government designated 50 activity centres across Melbourne, suburbs like Broadmeadows, Ringwood, Frankston and Epping, where they're rezoning for high-density residential towers. To fund the infrastructure needed to support this density, they're imposing a standardised developer contribution that industry bodies estimate at around $11,000 per new dwelling. Here's why this is project killing. Construction costs have already risen 40% since 2020. Margins on apartment developments in middle ring suburbs are already paper thin. When you add an $11,000 regulatory cost per apartment on top of rising materials, labour and financing costs, you make entire projects financially unviable. Developers are telling the government they simply can't make the numbers work.
For a normal, call it apartment in Melbourne now, a developer needs to be selling that for around $14,000 a square metre for the end product to be viable. And if you translate that into a modestly sized 3-bedroom unit, and 3 bedrooms are still where the bulk of the market is for new housing, then that translates into roughly $1.4 to $1.5 million.
The irony is savage. The government calls this value capture, arguing that by rezoning land to allow 20-storey towers instead of 3-storey buildings, they've created millions in value for landowners, so the state deserves a cut. But as Property Council CEO Mike Zorbas pointed out, value only exists if projects actually get built. If the tax makes projects unfeasible, there's no value created and no homes delivered. And there's a third tax hammer coming down, the Vacant Residential Land Tax, or VRLT. Previously limited to 16 inner-city councils, the tax on properties left vacant for more than 6 months was expanded statewide from January 2025. The rate starts at 1% of the capital improved value in year 1, then escalates to 2% and 3% in subsequent years. Think about what this means for a holiday homeowner in regional Victoria. Your $1 million beach house in Sorrento that you use sporadically? You're now facing a $10,000 tax bill in year 1 if it's deemed vacant, rising to $30,000 by year 3.
We've always had land tax, and developers, mums and dads, they've always accepted it. But this vacant land tax, it's criminal. I mean,
Explain to our national audience how that works.
Well, at the end of the day, if you aspire to buy a block of land, the government says, we're going to regulate your dream if you don't build within 12 months.
Regional Victoria listings have flooded as owners panic sell to avoid this massive liability. Now here's where all of this comes together. These taxes aren't random policy choices. They're desperate revenue-raising measures driven by Victoria's catastrophic debt position. And this brings us to the press conference meltdown that kicked off this entire controversy. On February 13, 2025, Premier Jacinta Allan held a press conference at a TAFE in Broadmeadows, one of the designated activity centres. She was there to announce housing plans. But journalists had other questions. They grilled her on the suburban rail loop, the state's signature infrastructure project with a price tag that ranges from $30 billion to over $125 billion, depending on who's counting.
Well, all right. No, I've finished on the SRL. No, I'm done on the... No, we're done. I've got it.
The federal government had just signalled they wouldn't write a blank cheque for the project. Journalists asked how Victoria would bridge the $2.2 billion funding gap. Would the $11,000 levy on new apartments be the only way to fund it? After 40 minutes of relentless questioning, the Premier, visibly frustrated, abruptly ended the conference with a terse "we're done" and walked out. For a leader usually disciplined in media management, this moment of visible irritation was seized upon by the opposition. It was framed as a meltdown, evidence that the government has no answers to the debt crisis and is crumbling under pressure. And they have a point, because Victoria's debt situation is genuinely dire. The state's net debt is projected to hit $194 billion by 2029. The daily interest bill is already $28.9 million.
Victoria's plunge into the red is projected to total $194 billion by 2028.
The opportunity cost on $194 billion is not theoretical. It's not academic. It's $1.2 million in interest every hour that cannot be spent on paying teachers, nurses, paramedics or police.
By 2028, Victoria will be spending over $10 billion annually just servicing debt. That's more than the entire cost of living package announced in the latest budget. This is what economists are calling a fiscal doom loop. High debt from pandemic spending and infrastructure blowouts forces the government to seek new revenue. They target the immobile asset class of property through land tax and developer levies. But these taxes reduce investment returns, causing capital to flee to lower tax states like Queensland and Western Australia. The exodus reduces transaction volumes, lowering stamp duty revenue, and stalls construction, reducing developer contributions. With revenue falling below projections, the deficit widens, necessitating even more aggressive taxation, restarting the cycle. And the data proves this loop is spinning. Nearly 50,000 new investor loans were issued in Victoria in the year to June 2024. But the state still lost 21,712 rental properties. That implies up to 70,000 investors sold during that period. The churn rate was nearly double a typical year. Melbourne accounted for the majority of this bloodbath, with active bonds dropping 3.7% year on year. The hardest hit local government areas include Nillumbik, Port Phillip, Manningham, and Monash. The only exception was Melton, a rapidly growing development hub on Melbourne's outskirts, where new supply kept bonds rising. And the selling isn't slowing. The Property Investment Professionals of Australia found that 22% of Melbourne investors sold at least one property in 2023 to 2024, one of the highest rates in Australia. PIPA Chair Kate Bakos directly blamed legislative changes around minimum rental standards and increased land taxes for driving investors out. The profile of the exiting investor is crucial. These aren't institutional landlords. They're households with one or two investment properties, the classic mum and dad investors. They're facing a perfect storm. Mortgage interest rates doubled, borrowing capacity slashed by federal regulators, new land tax surcharges adding 1,000 to 2,000 annually, vacant residential land tax risks, and stricter rental minimum standards requiring costly upgrades.
And his yearly land tax tripling to $3,000.
I'm no property mogul. I'm just a normal dad in living in the suburbs, trying to get ahead of ourselves by investing in property.
For many of these investors, the cumulative burden has made the property a liability rather than an asset. If holding costs are $30,000 annually in mortgage, tax and maintenance, and rent brings in $25,000 after tax, that's a $5,000 annual loss. The new land tax adds another $1,000 to $2,000 to that hole. Selling becomes the rational decision, and capital is mobile. Investors comparing Victoria to other jurisdictions are finding compelling reasons to move their money. Western Australia offers mining boom economics, lower entry prices, and rental yields of 5 to 6% versus Melbourne's 3 to 4%. Queensland offers growth potential and lower regulatory burdens. Buyers' agents report a massive shift in client briefs. Melbourne investors are now leapfrogging the state entirely to invest in Perth and Brisbane. The most immediate victims of this investor exodus aren't the landlords who sell and leave. They're the Victorian renters.
I've been looking for about 4 months now. It's frustrating, but at the same time, it's understandable. There are so many different people looking for a place.
Even if it's not the best room, glass is chipping off the ceiling, mould everywhere, you've still got at least 50 people lined up behind you.
Vacancy rates in Melbourne have hovered at historic lows of 1 to 1.5% for extended periods. A balanced market is considered 3%. This tightness has driven brutal rental inflation. While growth rates slowed slightly in late 2025 due to affordability ceilings being hit, the base level of rent is significantly higher than pre-pandemic. The correlation is undeniable. As investors sell 21,000 plus properties, those properties leave the rental pool. Many are bought by first home buyers, which is good for ownership, but terrible for rental supply. A share house with 4 renters gets replaced by a couple, instantly reducing rental efficiency. The supply side of the equation is shrinking just as demand from migration is booming. Property Council CEO Mike Zorbas captured the industry fury perfectly. In late 2023, the government signed a housing statement partnership with the industry, promising collaboration to build 800,000 homes. Industry agreed to support the targets in exchange for planning reforms and certainty. Then, weeks later, without consultation, the government introduced the VRLT expansion and floated the activity centre levies. Zorbas stated, "Here's a tip for state governments trying to reach ambitious housing goals in partnership. Don't do a Victoria. Don't seek redemption through a partnership with industry that you set on fire inside a fortnight." This wasn't just rhetoric. It signalled a complete rupture in trust. The large developers represented by the Property Council are the entities required to build the high-density towers in activity centres. If they don't trust the government's tax stability, they don't buy sites. They don't launch projects, and the housing targets fail. The government is effectively warring with the very builders it needs to achieve its goals. In an attempt to regain control of the narrative, Premier Allan has adopted populist rhetoric. Builders versus blockers. The strategy characterises anyone opposing activity centres or the taxes as NIMBYs blocking young people from buying homes. By rezoning wealthy suburbs like Brighton and Toorak for high density, the government frames opposition as elitist wealthy homeowners stopping young people. But this narrative is politically potent, yet economically flawed. The blockers in 2025 aren't just wealthy residents. They're the developers themselves who are blocking their own projects because the taxes make them unfeasible. The government is warring with the very builders it claims to champion. So where does this crisis go from here? The forecasts aren't encouraging. The rental market is likely to get worse before it gets better. With investors selling, accelerating, and construction starts declining due to high costs and developer levies, new supply isn't coming fast enough to offset the losses. Rents will continue rising until affordability completely breaks and people start doubling up in share houses or moving interstate. The government faces a brutal choice before the November 2026 election. Double down on the big build and the taxes required to fund it, or pivot to relieve pressure on the property sector and risk stalling the infrastructure agenda. Every indicator suggests they'll choose the former. The suburban rail loop contracts are already signed. The debt is already issued. They're locked into the spending trajectory. This means more aggressive taxation is coming, not less. The government's own budget papers show tax revenue increasing 22.3% from now to 2029, with the COVID Debt Levy continuing to rise by $300 million to $1.4 billion. Victorians will continue to be the most tax-burdened people in the country. And here's the kicker: Victoria has been ranked as the most indebted subnational jurisdiction globally among 17 comparable regions across Australia, Canada, and Germany. Let that sink in. Not the most indebted state in Australia. The most indebted comparable state-level government in the developed world. For investors still holding Victorian property, the question is stark. Do you ride out the storm and hope for a policy reversal after the 2026 election? Or do you join the exodus now before prices potentially fall further? The data shows those betting on a reversal are in the minority. Selling is accelerating, not slowing. For renters, the outlook is grim. The government's own policies have destroyed the private rental supply they depend on. Build-to-rent institutional projects offer a long-term solution, but they're premium products charging 10 to 20% rental premiums. They don't help the service worker in Dandenong who needs an affordable two-bedroom unit. Here's the bottom line. Victoria is running a live economic experiment. Can a state government tax its way out of debt using the property sector without collapsing housing supply? The early returns are brutal. 21,700 rental properties gone in 12 months. Investors selling at record rates. Construction starts declining. Rents spiking. And a premier so frustrated by questions about how to pay for it, all that she storms out of press conferences. The Premier's meltdown at Broadmeadows wasn't just a moment of frustration. It was a symptom of a government trapped by its own fiscal choices. The big build requires massive debt. The debt requires aggressive taxation. The taxation destroys investment. The investment collapse undermines the tax base. And the loop continues. Victoria's property investors aren't being destroyed by one tax. They're being destroyed by the cumulative weight of an entire policy stack designed to extract maximum revenue from a captive asset class. Land tax thresholds slashed, COVID debt surcharges added, vacant land tax expanded statewide, developer levies imposed, rental reforms increasing costs, all while federal regulators slash borrowing capacity and the Reserve Bank keeps interest rates elevated. The numbers don't lie. The Rental Bond Authority data is a complete census, not a survey. The decline is real. The exodus is real. And the rental crisis crushing Victorian tenants is the direct result of government policy that drove away the private landlords who provided affordable housing stock. I'll be tracking these stories every week as they develop. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video where I'll be breaking down which Australian states are now the safest for property investment, which are becoming uninvestable, and how to position your portfolio for what's coming next. Because if Victoria can go from property powerhouse to investor exodus in 18 months, it can happen anywhere. The Victorian tax crisis is real. The investor destruction is real. The Premier's frustration is real. And the rental crisis crushing families is the inevitable consequence of a government that chose infrastructure spending over housing affordability. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.